as the night gets a little quieter. Welcome to Midnight Whispers. I know many of you come here to relax, to slow your thoughts, and gently fall asleep. Whenever you feel like it, you can leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if these stories help you unwind, you can like the video or subscribe to the channel. Now, let's continue. I've told this story before, but it's one of those stories that never really loses its weight, no matter how many times it's repeated. It isn't technically my story. It belongs to my mother. But at the same time, it's mine too, because if it hadn't happened, there's a very real chance I wouldn't be here at all. When this took place, my mother was pregnant with me. She was still married to my biological father at the time. Their marriage didn't last forever, and they divorced a couple of years after I was born. But during this period, they were still together and, by her account, relatively happy. Life was simple in that way people often only realize later. They were young, expecting their first child, and trying to balance everyday responsibilities with their own interests and passions. My biological father was an actor with a local theater group in Pensacola, Florida. It wasn't a big, famous production company, but it was serious enough to demand long hours, rehearsals, and real commitment. Theater was important to him. It gave him purpose, structure, and a creative outlet that he loved deeply. Because rehearsals could run long and my mother wasn't working at the time, she often went with him. Pregnancy made her restless, and being alone at home all day wasn't good for her mental state. She also wasn't allowed to drive while pregnant. That part always surprises people when they hear it now, but it was something her doctor insisted on. Whether it was due to complications or just extreme caution, I don't know. What I do know is that it meant she relied entirely on my biological father to take her anywhere she needed or wanted to go. If he was going to rehearsal, she was going too. At first, she spent most of her time sitting in his dressing room. She'd bring a book and read while he was on stage, waiting for rehearsals to end. That worked for a while, but anyone who's ever sat alone for hours in a quiet, unfamiliar space knows how quickly boredom sets in. The novelty wears off fast, especially when you're pregnant, uncomfortable, and feeling cooped up. So she decided to make herself useful. She started helping out during dress rehearsals, not officially, not as staff, but simply as another set of eyes. She would bring a notepad and a pen and sit in different areas of the theater while the actors rehearsed with the orchestra. She took detailed notes, the kind of things an audience member might notice, but performers and directors sometimes miss when they're too close to the production. She'd note when one actor blocked another from view, depending on where you were sitting. If a prop or part of the set, like a tree, a wall, or the corner of a house, obstructed the line of sight from certain angles, she paid attention to the orchestra too, noting whether it was too loud or too quiet, whether it drowned out the singers or faded too much during important moments. For musical productions, balance mattered, and she had a good ear for it. She didn't stay in one place. Throughout rehearsals, she moved from one section of the theater to another. Sometimes she'd sit on the main floor. Other times, she'd go up to the balcony to see how things looked from above. She treated it almost like a job, even though no one had asked her to do it. Eventually, the director came to appreciate her notes, and they were taken seriously. Years later, my biological father told me that one of the productions they were working on during that time was either Fiddler on the Roof or Jesus Christ Superstar. He wasn't entirely sure which one lined up with this particular memory, but he remembered growing out a long beard for one of those roles. There's a photo of him holding me as a baby, beard and all, that I've seen more times than I can count. On the night this story centers around, rehearsal went late. The kind of late where everyone is tired, hungry, and mentally checked out, just going through the motions to get to the end. The curtain finally fell, signaling the end of the run-through. People began gathering their things, chatting quietly, and heading out. My mother was sitting in the upper balcony that night. By that point in her pregnancy, her belly was large enough that she couldn't see her feet when she looked down. Anyone who's been pregnant or been close to someone who was knows how much that affects balance and coordination. Your center of gravity shifts, your movements feel heavier, and stairs become a lot more dangerous than they look. She stood up, gathered her things, and made her way toward the stairs that led down from the balcony. The theater was mostly empty now. The stage lights were dimmed. The atmosphere had changed from busy and energetic to quiet and echoing. Every sound felt bigger in the stillness. As she began walking down the stairs, she misjudged a step. It happened quickly. 1 second, she was stepping forward. The next, her foot didn't land where she expected it to. Her body pitched forward, momentum pulling her down. She later told me that in that instant, her mind didn't think about herself at all. Her first thought was me, the baby she was carrying. The fear hit hard and fast, the certainty that she was about to fall, and that the fall could hurt us both. Then something else happened. As she started to fall forward, she felt a hand grab her upper arm. Not lightly, not like a brush or a fleeting touch. It was firm, strong, and unmistakably intentional. The grip stopped her forward motion and pulled her backward instead. At the same time, she heard a voice. It was close to her ear, low and calm, and it whispered, "Hold on, I've got you." The hand didn't let go. It guided her back, steadying her, helping her regain balance. She reached for the handrail with her free hand, gripping it tightly. With the support of the unseen hand and the rail, she was able to make it down the rest of the stairs safely, step by careful step, until she reached the landing. Once she was stable, the grip on her arm was gone. She stood there for a moment, heart racing, breath shallow, trying to process what had just happened. She expected to see someone beside her, an usher, another actor, anyone who might have been coming down the stairs at the same time. No one was there. She continued down into the lobby, still shaken, still replaying the sensation of that hand on her arm and the sound of the voice in her head. When she stepped out, the lobby was empty too. Quiet, still. The kind of quiet that feels heavier after something intense has just happened. A few minutes later, my biological father came up to meet her. She immediately asked him if he had seen anyone else up in the seats or on the stairs. Anyone at all. He told her no. He said the theater had been empty when he went up there. Everyone else had already left or was backstage packing up. There was no one who could have helped her. Later, she learned something else about the building. The theater company was located in a building that had once served as a hospital. It wasn't common knowledge among everyone, but it was part of the building's history. People who had worked there longer knew about it. It had treated patients long before it ever hosted plays and musicals. When my mother put all of that together, the thought crossed her mind that maybe what helped her wasn't a person at all. Maybe it was something else, someone else, a presence tied to that building, to its past. Perhaps a nurse, perhaps a doctor, someone whose instincts were so ingrained that even after death, they still reached out to prevent harm, especially to a pregnant woman and her unborn child. She never claimed to know for sure. She never turned it into a dramatic ghost story meant to scare people. She told it simply, honestly, as something that happened to her and stayed with her. If that hand hadn't grabbed her arm, If that voice hadn't told her to hold on, she might have fallen down a full flight of stairs while heavily pregnant. The outcome of that fall is something no one likes to think about. But she didn't fall, and I was born healthy. That's why this is her story, and mine too. Because sometimes the smallest moments, the ones that last only a few seconds, can change everything. And whether you believe in ghosts, spirits, or nothing at all, it's hard to ignore a moment where something unseen steps in at exactly the right time. Whatever it was, it saved us both. The story of Nacino Island is one of those histories that feels almost impossible to understand from the safety of the present. It does not feel real, even when you know it is documented, recorded, and remembered by people who lived through it. It feels like something that belongs to nightmares or to fiction, but it happened to real people, in a real place, within living memory. The suffering was not quick. It was not accidental. It unfolded slowly, driven by hunger, fear, and a system that treated human beings as disposable. Nacino Island, sometimes called the Island of Death, was located on the Ob River in Siberia. In 1933, during the Soviet era, thousands of people were sent there as part of a forced resettlement program. Many of them were not criminals in the way people imagine criminals. Some were homeless, some were peasants. Some were people picked up in cities for not having proper documents. They were labeled as socially harmful and deported without real trials or preparation. The journey itself was brutal. People were packed onto barges and transported under terrible conditions. They were not given enough food. They were not given proper clothing. Many were already weak by the time they arrived. When they reached Nacino Island, what awaited them was not a camp, not housing, not infrastructure, but a bare island with marshy ground, swarms of insects, freezing nights, and almost no shelter. There were no buildings ready for them, no tools to build with, no supplies to sustain them. Guards were present, but they were not there to protect the people. They were there to keep them from escaping. The deportees were essentially abandoned on the island and told to survive. Food was almost non-existent. Some flour was distributed at first, but there were no ovens, no pots, no way to cook properly. People mixed flour with river water and tried to eat it raw, which caused sickness and death. Hunger set in quickly. Within days, people were collapsing from exhaustion. Within weeks, starvation became widespread. As hunger grew more severe, the social fabric completely collapsed. People stopped thinking in terms of community or morality because survival itself was slipping away. Violence increased. Stronger individuals preyed on weaker ones. Guards sometimes shot people who tried to flee, leaving bodies behind. Those bodies did not stay untouched for long. Cannibalism began. At first, it was whispered about. Then it became known. Then it became unavoidable. People began cutting flesh from the dead. Later, as starvation became absolute, some began cutting flesh from the living. Not out of madness in the way horror movies portray it, but out of desperation so extreme that the human mind breaks under the pressure. Women were especially vulnerable. They were targeted because they were often physically weaker and less able to defend themselves. There are documented accounts of women being attacked and having parts of their bodies cut away while they were still alive. Calves and breasts were targeted because they were seen as sources of meat that could be removed without immediately killing the person. At least not right away. One of the most haunting accounts comes from a woman named Feofila Bailina, a resident of the village of Nacino on the north bank of the Ob River. In 1989, decades after the events, She gave an oral history that captured the horror in a way no official report ever could. She recalled that one night, a woman from the island of death was brought into her house. The woman was being transported to another camp and needed a place to stay for the night. She was taken into the back room. Theophila noticed something deeply wrong and asked what had happened to her. The woman explained that her calves had been cut off on Nazino Island. They had cut them off and cooked them. The meat on her legs was gone. Because of this, her legs were constantly freezing. She had wrapped them in rags to keep what little warmth she could. Despite her injuries, she was still able to move on her own. What struck Theophila most was how the woman looked. She appeared like an old woman, worn down by life, fragile and broken. But in reality, she was only a little over 40 years old. Hunger, pain, and trauma had aged her beyond recognition. This was not an isolated story. It was one example among many. What makes Nazino Island so disturbing is not just the acts themselves, but the conditions that allowed them to happen. The people sent there were not given a chance. There was no plan for survival, no meaningful oversight, no intervention when it became clear that things were going horribly wrong. Reports of death and cannibalism were slow to reach authorities, and when they did, the response was minimal and delayed. By the time the situation was finally addressed, thousands were already dead. The island itself became a mass grave. Bodies were left where they fell. Some were buried shallowly, others not at all. The living walked among the dead daily. Hunger erased taboos that humans rely on to stay human. When the body is pushed far enough, the mind follows. It is important to understand that the people who committed these acts were not monsters in the way we like to imagine monsters. They were ordinary people placed in an extraordinary situation of deprivation. That does not excuse the violence, but it does explain how such things become possible. Nazino Island shows what happens when a system removes dignity, resources, and hope all at once. The Soviet authorities eventually evacuated some survivors and quietly shut down the camp. The story was buried for decades. It was not openly discussed. Survivors carried their trauma in silence. Villagers along the Ob River remembered what they had seen, but had little power to speak about it. Only much later did historians uncover documents, testimonies, and survivor accounts that revealed the full scale of what happened. Even now, many people have never heard of Nazino Island. It does not appear often in textbooks. It does not fit neatly into narratives of progress or heroism. But stories like Theophila Bailina's matter because they bring the human cost into focus. Statistics can tell you how many died. Documents can outline policies. But one woman, wrapping her mutilated legs in rags so they do not freeze, tells you what starvation really looks like. It tells you what happens when people are reduced to bodies, struggling to stay alive one more day. Nazino Island forces uncomfortable questions. How thin is the line between civilization and collapse? Oh, how much suffering can a human endure before survival instincts override everything else? What responsibility does a government have for the people it controls? And how many similar stories have been lost because no one was willing to listen? This was not ancient history. It happened in the 20th century. The witnesses lived long enough to tell their stories to people who are still alive today. The pain did not vanish when the island was abandoned. It lived on in the memories of survivors, villagers, and families who never saw their loved ones again. When people talk about starvation, it is often abstract. Numbers, charts, famine statistics. Nazino Island strips that abstraction away. It shows starvation as something intimate, something that happens to bodies and relationships, something that corrodes morality itself. It shows how hunger can turn a place into something worse than a prison, worse than a battlefield. And yet within that horror, there are still moments that reveal humanity. The fact that Theophila took that woman into her home. The fact that she remembered her story decades later. The fact that survivors tried to care for each other when they could. These moments do not erase the horror, but they remind us that even in the darkest conditions, people still notice, still remember, still bear witness. Nazino Island should not be remembered for shock value or sensationalism. It should be remembered as a warning about what happens when people are treated as expendable, a warning about how quickly systems can collapse into cruelty when ideology replaces compassion, a warning about how easily suffering can be hidden when it happens far away from centers of power. The woman Theophila described survived, at least long enough to leave the island. Many did not. And even those who lived carried scars that never healed, on their bodies and in their minds. When you read about Nazino Island, it is natural to want to turn away. The details are too heavy. The cruelty feels unbearable. But forgetting is its own kind of violence. These stories exist because someone lived through them, because someone remembered, because someone finally wrote them down. They deserve to be heard. Not because they are shocking, but because they are true. This is one of those stories that completely changes how you look at people, especially the ones you think you understand. It's not dramatic in the moment. There are no warning signs, no raised voices, no strange behavior that sets off alarms. That's what makes it so disturbing. Everything feels normal right up until it isn't. And then the realization hits all at once. This happened during my second year of college when I was working as a student teacher at a high school. I was still learning how to manage a classroom, how to read students, how to balance being approachable while still being authoritative. I took the job seriously, but I was also young and still idealistic. I believed that most people were basically good or at least predictable. That belief didn't survive this experience. That afternoon, I was teaching one of my regular classes. It wasn't a special day in any obvious way. No lockdown drills, no disruptions, no tension in the air, just a normal class period, the kind you forget as soon as it's over. Students came in, took their seats, did their work, talked a little, complained a little, the usual. One of the students in my class was going to be moving away soon. Everyone knew it was his last day. That alone can sometimes cause odd behavior. Some students act out, some get emotional, some withdraw. But he didn't do any of that. He was completely normal. Actually, more than normal. He behaved perfectly throughout the entire class. He paid attention. He followed instructions. He didn't cause any trouble. If anything, he was one of the easier students to manage that day. Nothing about him stood out in a negative way. When class ended, he didn't rush out like most students do. Instead, he came up to me calmly and politely. He thanked me for the classes I had taught him and said he appreciated what I'd done before he moved away. It was one of those small moments that makes teaching feel worthwhile. A student taking the time to say thank you. It felt genuine, respectful, human. I remember thinking that he seemed like a good kid. Then the day ended. I went home. I didn't think about him again that evening. Why would I? As far as I knew, it was just another normal day in a long string of normal days. The next morning, everything changed. We received an urgent email from the school principal. The tone was serious, clipped, clearly written in a hurry. The kind of email that makes your stomach tighten before you even finish reading it. The student had been arrested. Not for something minor, not for theft or vandalism or fighting. He had attacked someone with an axe. According to the information shared earlier that same morning before he came to school, he had assaulted a person with an axe, then stolen their scooter and their money. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a violent attack. And then, after doing that, he went to school, he went to class, he sat in my classroom, he listened, he behaved, he thanked me politely. All of this happened less than 2 hours after the attack. That's the part that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. The timeline. The fact that he had committed an extremely violent act, something most people would associate with rage, panic, chaos, or emotional breakdown, and then simply switched it off. He blended back into normal life. He didn't look shaken. He didn't act nervous. He didn't say anything strange. He was calm. Too calm. I remember rereading the email several times, trying to make sense of it. My brain kept rejecting the information. It felt like the school must have made a mistake, that it had to be another student with the same name, that there was some confusion. But there wasn't. It was him, the same student who had sat a few feet away from me, the same student who had spoken to me politely, the same student I had looked in the eyes and thought was completely ordinary. The realization hit slowly and then all at once. I had been in a room with someone who had just committed an act of extreme violence, not hours or days before, that same morning, and I had no idea. I started replaying the class in my head, in every movement, every word, every expression on his face. I tried to spot something I had missed, a flicker of guilt, a moment of agitation, anything. There was nothing. That's what terrified me the most. There were no warning signs, no shaking hands, no strange comments, no visible distress. He wasn't acting like someone who had just attacked another human being with an axe. He was acting like a regular student on his last day of school. I remember feeling sick when it really sank in. My hands went cold. My chest felt tight. I thought about how close he had been to me, to other students, to everyone in that room. What if something had set him off? What if someone had said the wrong thing? What if he hadn't been done being violent? Those questions don't have answers, and that's part of what makes the experience so unsettling. You realize how much of your sense of safety depends on assumptions. The assumption that violent people look violent, that danger announces itself, that you'll be able to tell. Sometimes you can't. This wasn't a stranger in a dark alley. This was a kid in a classroom. A polite, quiet student who followed rules and said thank you. The contrast between who he appeared to be and what he had done was impossible to reconcile. After that day, teaching never felt quite the same. I became more aware of how little you truly know about the internal lives of the people around you, how thin the line can be between normal and catastrophic, how easily someone can compartmentalize actions in a way that defies everything you think you understand about human behavior. It also made me think about how society talks about violence. We like to believe it comes from obvious monsters, from people who are visibly unstable or openly aggressive. But sometimes it comes from someone who can sit quietly in a classroom and say goodbye like nothing happened. That realization is deeply uncomfortable. I also couldn't stop thinking about the victim, about how their life was changed in an instant while the person who attacked them went on with his morning like it was any other day. That disconnect between cause and effect, between violence and consequence, is chilling. For a long time after, I felt uneasy around students in a way I never had before. Not paranoid exactly, but more alert, more aware that appearances mean very little. That behavior in a structured environment doesn't always reflect what someone is capable of outside of it. I don't know what happened to that student after his arrest. I don't know the details of his trial or his sentence. I don't know what led him to commit the attack in the first place. And honestly, I'm not sure any explanation would make it easier to process. What stays with me isn't curiosity about his motives. It's the memory of how normal he seemed. The memory of him thanking me. The knowledge that I was sharing a space with someone who had just committed extreme violence, and that there was nothing in that moment that warned me. This story still bothers me because it strips away a comforting illusion. The illusion that danger is obvious, that it announces itself, that you'll always know when you're near it. Sometimes danger sits quietly in a desk, raises its hand when asked, completes its work, and walks out the door without incident. And you don't find out until the next day through an email that makes your stomach drop that the person you were just talking to had already crossed the line most people never will. That kind of realization doesn't fade. It changes how you see people, how you interpret calmness, how you understand violence. And it leaves you with a lingering, unsettling thought. If someone can do something that brutal and then walk into a classroom like nothing happened, how many other moments have we all been closer to danger than we ever realized? That question still has no answer. And maybe that's the... This is one of those stories that feels unreal no matter how many times you go over it. It doesn't feel like something that should have happened to real people in a real house, in a quiet community. And yet it did. It happened slowly, tragically, and in a way that left scars long after the bodies were gone. For years, it was barely spoken about, almost erased. Not because it wasn't painful, but because it was too painful to face. The story takes place in the early 1900s, in a small community somewhere in the United States. Life there was simple in the way life used to be. People knew their neighbors. Families stayed in the same houses for generations. Faith was central to daily life, not something discussed casually, but something that shaped decisions, traditions, and even silence. This was a deeply Catholic family I respected in their community. Raising 3 children and living what most people would have described as a good, honest life. The parents were ordinary people. A hard-working father, a mother devoted to her family, and 3 children growing up in a time when childhood was less sheltered and more physical, filled with chores, outdoor play, and long days. Their house wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It was a home, and that was enough. One particular weekend was meant to be quiet for the parents. Plans had been made for all 3 children to visit family out of town. It wasn't unusual. Families relied on each other, especially back then, and children often spent weekends with relatives. Everything was set, bags packed, expectations clear, but as often happens, plans changed. One of the children, a son, wasn't feeling well. Nothing dramatic at first, just enough that it didn't feel right to send him away. A fever, maybe weakness, something that made his parents decide he should stay home. The other 2 children went on as planned, leaving the house quieter than usual. Just the mother, the father, and the one child who stayed behind. At first, the weekend passed normally. The boy rested. His parents took care of him. There was nothing to suggest that anything terrible was about to happen. But there was something else that had been a source of tension for a long time. A neighborhood dog. The dog didn't belong to the family, but it wandered freely, as animals often did in those days. It had a habit of showing up on their property, especially near the trash cans. It barked loudly and often, sometimes late into the night. It wasn't a new problem. It had been happening for a long time. and it had worn down the father's patience. That night, the dog was especially loud. It barked and barked outside the house near the trash cans, the sound carrying clearly through the quiet night. The boy who had stayed behind lay in his bed, already not feeling well, trying to sleep. The noise wouldn't stop. Every bark echoed in the house, sharp and constant. The father was angry. This wasn't just about the noise, it was about weeks, maybe months of frustration, about feeling disrespected by neighbors who didn't control their animals, about wanting peace in his own home. In that moment, something snapped. He decided that he was done with it. He made the decision to put an end to the barking that night. He went upstairs to the bedroom where the shotgun was kept. Back then, firearms were common in households, especially in rural or small communities. They were tools used for hunting, protection, and pest control. The father intended to take the gun and shoot the dog outside. The mother immediately objected. She didn't approve of killing the dog. Whether it was out of compassion, fear of consequences, or simply not wanting violence, she was firmly against it. What started as a disagreement quickly became an argument. Voices were raised. Tension filled the room. The boy downstairs could hear them, though he likely didn't understand what was happening yet. As the father reached for the shotgun, the mother tried to stop him. She tried to take the gun from him. What happened next was a moment that changed everything. In the struggle, the shotgun went off. The mother was shot. It wasn't intentional. There was no plan to harm her. But accidents don't care about intentions. The blast hit her, and she fell to the floor. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. From the father's perspective, it looked like she was dead. The room went silent. In that silence, the weight of what had just happened crashed down on him all at once. Shock, horror, guilt, fear, regret. There was no time for reason to take hold. No time to think about checking her pulse, calling for help, or considering that she might still be alive. In that moment, overwhelmed by what he believed he had done, the father turned the gun on himself. He didn't hesitate. He committed suicide right there in the bedroom. The sound of the second gunshot was what changed everything again. The mother wasn't dead. She was unconscious, or barely conscious. But the second blast jolted her awake. Pain flooded her body, confusion, terror. She realized what had happened in an instant. Her husband was dead. She was badly injured, and her child was in the house. Downstairs, the boy heard the shots. Two loud, terrifying explosions in the middle of the night. He got out of bed and ran upstairs, frightened and confused, heading toward his parents' bedroom to see what was going on. The mother saw him or heard him coming. Somehow, despite her injuries, she gathered enough strength to speak. When the boy reached the room, she told him to run. She told him to go to the neighbors and get help immediately. There was no time to explain. No time for comfort, just urgency. The boy did what she said. He ran. He ran out of the house, into the night, toward the nearest neighbors, desperate and terrified, and carrying a message he didn't fully understand but knew was important. Back in the bedroom, the mother was alone. She was injured, bleeding, and in shock. But she wasn't done fighting. She crawled across the floor toward a nearby window. She knew that help needed to come fast. If she could draw attention, maybe someone would hear her before it was too late. She reached the window and shattered it. Glass exploded inward. The sound cut through the night air. She tried to pull herself up so she could scream for help, her body screaming in pain with every movement. But as she broke the glass and dragged herself upward, shards sliced into her wrists, deeply. She didn't realize it at first. Adrenaline kept her moving. She screamed for help. She called out into the night, but the cuts were severe. Blood poured from her wrists, faster than she could stop it. Weakened by the gunshot wound, she couldn't fight the bleeding. Before the boy could return with help, she bled out. By the time anyone arrived, it was over. Two parents dead in the same room. one from suicide, one from a combination of injury and desperate action, and a child who survived, carrying the memory of that night for the rest of his life. The dog was never the story. What happened afterward is just as haunting in a different way. Because this was a devoutly Catholic family, the truth became a problem. Suicide was considered a grave sin. Someone who took their own life could not be buried in consecrated ground, could not be laid to rest with family, could not be openly mourned in the same way. The family faced a terrible choice, so they buried the story instead. Details were softened. Facts were omitted. Conversations ended abruptly. Over time, the truth faded into whispers and half-remembered fragments. The tragedy became something people didn't talk about. Not because it wasn't important, but because acknowledging it would mean confronting shame, grief, and religious consequences they weren't prepared to face. For years, this story stayed hidden within the family. Children grew up without knowing exactly what had happened. Adults avoided the subject. The night became a shadow in the family history, felt but not named. Trauma doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It just changes shape. It shows up in silence, in anxiety, in things no one can quite explain. What makes this story so devastating isn't just the deaths themselves. It's how fast everything unraveled. A barking dog, a moment of anger, an argument, an accident, panic, guilt. 2 lives lost in minutes, leaving behind a child and a family forever changed. It was also terrifying how close it came to being different. If the gun hadn't gone off, if the father had paused, if the mother hadn't tried to grab it, if the father had checked on her before acting, if help had come sooner. So many moments where things could have shifted. Instead, the worst possible chain of events unfolded. This story doesn't feel like a cautionary tale. It feels like a reminder of how fragile life is, how emotions can overwhelm reason, and how accidents don't care about morality or faith. It shows how tragedy doesn't always come from cruelty or evil, but from fear, impulse, and moments that spiral out of control. And it shows how families carry trauma quietly, long after the house is empty, long after the neighbors are gone, long after the graves are filled. Some stories are hidden not because they're unimportant, but because they hurt too much to speak aloud. This was one of those stories. Sad, shocking, and almost impossible to fully process, even now. And maybe that's why it stayed buried for so long. Because once you say it out loud, it becomes real again. And some pain never truly fades. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers for daily true horror stories that stay with you long after they're told, quietly unsettling and meant for the late hours. You can also turn on notifications so you're always here when a new story arrives and the night begins to stir again. Now, let's continue. This is one of those stories that sits heavy in your chest. Not because it's shocking in a sensational way, but because it feels painfully human. It's sad in a quiet, lingering way that doesn't go away once you've heard it. The kind of sadness that makes you think about all the moments where things could have gone differently, and how often people slip through the cracks without anyone really noticing until it's too late. There was an old classmate of mine that I hadn't spoken to in years. We weren't close friends by the time we were adults, but we had history. Shared classrooms, shared hallways. The kind of familiarity where you don't keep in touch, but you still remember who they were when you were younger. When I think back to him now, what stands out isn't one specific memory, but a general sense that he always struggled. He always had demons. If it wasn't drugs, it was alcohol. That was just part of who he was, even back then. Some people experiment, grow out of it, find balance. He never really did. It always seemed like he was fighting something inside himself, using substances as a way to quiet it down, even if only temporarily. You could tell he was trying to numb something, though none of us had the language to describe that at the time. We were young. We didn't know how to recognize real pain when it didn't look dramatic. Years passed. Life moved on the way it always does. People married, had kids, got jobs, drifted apart. He faded into the background of my life, someone I thought about occasionally, but never reached out to. I'd hear bits and pieces about him through mutual friends. Nothing good, nothing surprising. Struggles, relapses, problems. Then periods where things seemed stable again, at least on the surface. One day, a friend of mine reached out with news I wasn't prepared for. He had killed himself. He had hanged himself. Hearing that stopped me cold. But in a strange way, the act itself wasn't the most shocking part. It was devastating, yes, heartbreaking. But given everything he'd battled for years, it wasn't entirely unexpected. That's a terrible thing to say, but it's the truth. When someone spends their life fighting addiction and inner torment, the fear that one day it might end this way is always there, even if you don't want to admit it. What really shook me was how he was found. No one had checked on him for a long time. Days passed, then more days, then a week, maybe 2. No one heard from him. No one knocked on the door. No one noticed anything was wrong right away. The only reason anyone went looking was because he stopped collecting his mail. The mail carrier noticed. After a week or 2 of mail piling up untouched, the mail person filed a welfare report. That small act of attention, something so routine and procedural, was what finally led to someone checking on him. It's strange to think about how his absence went unnoticed by the people closest to him, but was noticed by someone whose job was simply to deliver envelopes. When authorities entered the apartment, they found him. He had been gone for some time. By then, the smell was overwhelming, so bad that it had seeped into everything. Furniture, clothing, walls, the air itself. The kind of smell that doesn't leave no matter how much you clean. Because of that, the family had no choice but to discard almost everything in the apartment. They lost more than a person. They lost a home full of memories. While they were grieving, they were also forced to throw away belongings, photos, personal items, pieces of his life that could never be replaced. It's hard to imagine having to make those decisions while still trying to process the shock of losing someone you love. There was no time to sit with the grief properly. It was compounded by logistics, by damage control, by the reality of death in its most unforgiving form. As more details came out, the story became even heavier. He had recently lost his job. That alone can be enough to destabilize someone who is already struggling. Work isn't just income. It's structure, purpose, identity. When that disappears, everything else can start to feel like it's unraveling too. For him, it seems like that loss set off something much deeper. He had become convinced that his wife had cheated on him. Not just suspected. He was sure of it. He believed that their newest child wasn't his. Whether that belief was grounded in reality or fueled by paranoia, depression, substance abuse, or some combination of all 3, no one can say for certain. But what matters is that it felt real to him. Real enough to consume him. Real enough to poison his thoughts and make him feel betrayed, humiliated, and worthless. He already had a little girl. She was about 5 years old. That detail hurts the most. A 5-year-old doesn't understand addiction. She doesn't understand paranoia or job loss or mental illness. She just knows that her dad was there, and then one day, he wasn't. She won't remember him clearly. Her memories will be blurry, made up of fragments and stories told by other people. Photos she looks at later, words like, "He loved you," spoken by adults who are trying to make sense of the loss themselves. She will grow up with questions that don't have easy answers. Why wasn't I enough for him to stay? Why didn't he get help? Was it my fault? Those are questions children often carry quietly, even when everyone around them insists it wasn't their fault. Grief doesn't care about logic. It finds its own shape and settles where it can. His wife lost her husband. His children lost their father. His family lost a son, a brother, a piece of themselves. And all of it happened in silence. That's what keeps coming back to me when I think about this story. The silence. The fact that no one noticed for so long. That he was alone with his thoughts, his fears, his demons, long enough for everything to end without interruption. I don't know what his final days were like. I don't know if he planned it carefully, or if it was an impulsive moment when everything felt unbearable. I don't know if he reached out to anyone and didn't get a response, or if he convinced himself that no one would care anyway. What I do know is that he needed help. Real help. Not just someone telling him to stop drinking. Not just someone telling him to get it together. He needed support, treatment, compassion, and probably more patience than the world tends to give people like him. Addiction and mental illness don't respond well to shame or frustration. But that's often what people receive instead. It's easy, after the fact, to say he should have done this or that. He should have asked for help. He should have trusted someone. He should have stayed for his kids. But should have doesn't mean much when someone's mind is working against them. When depression, paranoia, and addiction twist reality into something cruel and convincing, logic loses its power. The voice in your head becomes louder than the voices of people who love you. I wish he had gotten the help he needed. I wish someone had stepped in sooner. I wish he had believed, even for a moment, that things could still change. Because despite everything, he wasn't just his demons. He wasn't just his addictions or his mistakes. He was someone who once sat in classrooms, laughed with friends, dreamed about a future. He became a husband. He became a father. Those things don't disappear just because someone loses a battle with their inner world. His death is a reminder of how quiet suffering can be. Not everyone cries for help in obvious ways. Not everyone reaches out when they're drowning. Some people isolate. Some people convince themselves they are a burden. Some people believe the world would be better off without them, even when that couldn't be further from the truth. It also makes me think about how we measure concern. A mail carrier noticed because the routine was broken. Mail piled up. That was the sign. Not a phone call, not a message, not a knock on the door from a friend. Just unopened envelopes sitting where they shouldn't have been. It's sobering to realize how easily someone can disappear without anyone noticing right away, especially when they're struggling quietly. I don't tell this story to shock people. I tell it because it matters. Because people like him exist everywhere. In old classmates, in co-workers, in neighbors, in family members. People who seem functional enough on the outside but are fighting something relentless on the inside. People who might not make it unless someone notices, unless someone intervenes, unless they get real support instead of judgment. I think about his little girl sometimes, about the life she'll grow into without him. I think about the wife, grieving not just the loss, but also the confusion, the anger, the unanswered questions, wondering what she missed, wondering if she could have done more. Those thoughts haunt survivors just as much as grief does. And I think about him, not as the man who took his own life, but as the kid I once knew, who clearly needed help long before everything fell apart. A person who deserved a chance at healing, even if he didn't believe he did. It's easy to say someone succumbed to their demons, but demons aren't monsters in the story. They're illnesses, trauma, addiction, despair, and distorted thinking. They're powerful, especially when faced alone. I wish his story had ended differently. I wish the mail carrier's concern hadn't come too late. I wish he had lived long enough to see that losing a job, questioning a relationship, feeling broken inside, none of that means the end. It means you need help, not disappearance. This is one of those stories that doesn't scare you in a traditional sense. It hurts, and it stays with you, because it reminds you how fragile people can be, how quietly lives can fall apart, and how important it is to notice when someone starts to disappear. My mom told me this story recently, and ever since she said it out loud, it has been stuck in my head. Not because it was some urban legend or a spooky rumor, but because it happened in a real place, to real people, in a town where everyone knew everyone, the kind of small town where nothing ever really happens, where news travels fast, and where the idea of something violent feels almost impossible. That's why it hit so hard. It wasn't a story about a stranger far away. It was something that happened in the same quiet streets my mom used to walk down. In the same kind of neighborhood where people leave their doors unlocked and assume they're safe. She told me that when she was younger, living in that small town, there was a murder so horrifying that the entire town basically shut down. People didn't go out unless they had to. And parents kept their children inside. Shops closed early. Streets that were normally quiet became even quieter, like the whole town was holding its breath. It wasn't because of a storm or some natural disaster. It was because of one man. The town stayed on edge for days because the man responsible for the murder was still out there. Nobody knew where he was. Nobody knew what he might do next. And worst of all, people believed him when he said he wasn't finished. The fear wasn't just that he had killed someone. It was the fear that he might kill again. According to my mom, the man who did it was known to have serious mental issues. People in town already thought he was unstable. Not in the harmless, eccentric way that some small towns tolerate, but in a way that made people uncomfortable. The kind of person who gives you a bad feeling in your stomach when you pass them on the street. The kind of person you don't want to make eye contact with. Someone whose behavior didn't seem normal, even before anything happened. But no one expected what he was capable of. One day, without warning, he murdered his wife. Not in private. Not behind closed doors in a way that could be hidden. He did it right in front of his children. He had 3 kids, 2 boys and 1 little girl. And those kids witnessed something that no child should ever have to see. My mom said it wasn't just a murder. It was like an explosion of madness inside that house. Like something snapped and turned him into someone unrecognizable. After he killed her, he didn't stop. He hung her body up from the ceiling. Even writing that feels sickening. It's not the kind of thing you expect to hear in a story that comes from a small town. It sounds like something out of a nightmare, something too extreme to be real. But according to my mom, this is exactly what happened. He strung her up as if she wasn't even a human being anymore. And then he began to beat her, even after she was already dead. Like he was trying to destroy her completely. The violence didn't have a purpose. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about something darker, something broken. Then came the part that made the whole town believe he had completely lost his mind. He claimed he pulled her eyes out. He said he did it to give them to a stray cat that only had one eye. That detail is what makes the story feel so unreal, because it isn't just cruel, it's twisted. It's the kind of thing that doesn't come from normal rage. It comes from delusion. From a mind that isn't operating in reality anymore. The kind of thought process that no sane person could follow. And all of this happened with his children there. Those kids weren't just nearby. They were trapped in the house, watching their father become something terrifying. Watching their mother die. Watching the aftermath. Seeing blood everywhere. Hearing sounds they would never forget. In the moment, they must have been frozen with fear, not even understanding how to react, because when you're a child, your parents are supposed to be the safest people in the world. But in that house, the father was the danger. At some point after the murder, he fled. But he didn't flee alone. He took the little girl with him. The two boys managed to escape. My mom said they ran to a nearby neighbor's house, terrified, desperate, and probably covered in blood. They banged on the door, crying, screaming, begging for help. The neighbor, shocked and horrified, called the police immediately. When police arrived at the house, they walked into something that looked like a slaughter scene. My mom said the officers described it as blood everywhere. Not just a little. Not a single room. The whole place was covered. Walls, floor, furniture. It was the kind of scene that stays in your mind forever if you see it. The kind of scene that changes the people who respond to it. Even trained officers. The town found out quickly. Because in a small town you can't hide news like that. People started talking. Rumors spread faster than facts. Everyone wanted to know what happened. Everyone wanted to know if the man had been caught. But he was gone. And that's when fear turned into panic. Because the man didn't just run away. He left behind a message, or at least a statement, that became known in town. According to my mom, he said something that made everyone realize they weren't dealing with a normal criminal. He said that the Virgin Mary had spoken to him. He claimed the Virgin Mary told him she wanted 12 little angels, and that meant he needed to kill 12 children. Whether he truly believed that, or whether he said it to scare people, it worked. Because the moment those words spread, the entire town went into survival mode. Parents refused to let their kids walk alone. Schools became tense. People locked doors that had never been locked before. Mothers watched their windows. Fathers checked outside at night. The idea that a man who had already murdered his wife in such a brutal way was now running around with a little girl, claiming he needed to kill more children, was too terrifying to ignore. For days, the town felt like it was under siege. My mom said it was almost like a shutdown. Not officially, like the government closing everything, but socially. People stayed inside, businesses slowed down, streets emptied. Everyone was watching everyone. People looked at passing cars like they were threats. If someone knocked on a door unexpectedly, people hesitated before answering. That kind of fear spreads quickly. And once it spreads, it infects everything. Every child became a potential target in people's minds. Every shadow felt suspicious. Every unfamiliar sound made people jump. And somewhere out there, that man was still free. Eventually, he was caught. My mom didn't go into all the details of how they found him, but she said the relief in the town was immediate. People could finally breathe again. Parents could finally let their children sleep without checking locks 5 times. But even with him arrested, the damage was already done. The story had carved itself into the town's memory. It became something people whispered about for years, something that older residents never forgot. The man was sentenced to prison, and he stayed there for a long time. Something like 35 to 40 years, according to what my mom heard. Long enough that people stopped talking about him daily. Long enough that kids who weren't even born at the time grew up hearing about it as a scary story, not as a current threat. Long enough that the world moved forward, even though that family never could. But what shocked me the most was what came next. After those decades, he was eventually released back into the world. By then, he would have been old, maybe 70 or 80. An old man, probably weak, probably gray-haired, probably moving slowly. But that doesn't erase what he did. It doesn't erase the terror he caused. It doesn't erase the memory of a woman murdered in her own home while her children watched. It doesn't erase the blood. It doesn't erase the fact that he took a little girl and disappeared. Because that is the other part of the story that never got closure. The daughter was never found. At least not that my mom knows, not that anyone in the town ever heard. She vanished with him that day. And after that, it was like she disappeared off the face of the earth. And that thought is terrifying in its own way. Because what happened to her? Did he harm her? Did she survive? Was she raised under a different name somewhere else? Did someone take her in without knowing who she was? Did she grow up carrying a trauma so deep that she never spoke about it? No one knows. And that unknown is what keeps the story alive. Because murder is horrific, but uncertainty is its own kind of horror. When someone vanishes, your mind fills the gap with endless possibilities, and most of them are worse than the truth. I think about those 2 boys who escaped. I think about what they must have carried with them for the rest of their lives. They didn't just lose their mother. They lost her in the most brutal way imaginable. They lost their sense of safety. They lost their sister. And they lost their childhood in a single day. And then there's the town itself. Small towns remember things like this forever. A place like that doesn't have hundreds of murders a year. It's not like a big city where violence becomes statistics. In a small town, one horrific crime can define a decade. It becomes a marker in time. People remember where they were when they heard about it. They remember who told them. They remember the silence in the streets afterward. My mom said it changed everything for a while. People didn't trust the way they used to. They didn't assume their neighbors were safe. They didn't assume their community was protected. The illusion that nothing truly evil could happen there was shattered. And the most chilling part is the idea that it all happened so fast. One day, a family was living their life. The next day, the mother was dead, the father was gone, and the daughter had vanished. Just like that. In a matter of hours, a normal household became a crime scene, and a small town became a place filled with fear. Whenever I think about this story, I keep coming back to the same thing. How helpless those kids must have felt. Because when you're a child, you assume adults will protect you. You assume police will arrive quickly. You assume that if you scream, someone will come. But in that house, none of those assumptions mattered. They were alone with a man who had lost his grip on reality. And even after the police came, even after he was arrested, the damage couldn't be undone. A life was taken. A child was lost. A family was destroyed. And decades later, the horror still lingered in the town like a stain. That's why my mom still remembers it so clearly. Not because it was just a crime, but because it was the moment the town realized that evil wasn't something that happened elsewhere. It could happen right there, behind a normal front door, in the middle of a quiet street, to a family that had done nothing wrong. And the scariest part of all is that even now, there is still no ending. The daughter is still missing. The answers are still incomplete. And somewhere out there is a little girl who might have grown up carrying a secret that began with blood on the walls and a town that shut down in fear. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If you're still here, then these stories didn't simply fade away. They settled in. Every story you heard tonight came from real moments, real people, and real situations where something felt off or nearly went wrong. If you want to keep exploring stories that linger in your thoughts long after the night grows quiet, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers. There are more stories waiting in the dark, and not all of them let you leave in time.